On the island of Cyprus, in a quiet workshop above the sea, there once stood a statue so lifelike that the man who carved it could not stop looking at it. Carved from gleaming ivory and dressed in fine robes, the figure was a young woman, more graceful, more gentle, and more perfect than any living person its maker had ever met. That was precisely the problem. The sculptor's name was Pygmalion, and he had given up on people, on their coarseness, their vanity, their endless disappointments, and had poured everything he had into a woman made of ivory instead. Day by day he spoke to her softly and brought her little gifts, and in time, though he hardly dared admit it even to himself, he fell completely in love with something that could never love him back. What do the gods do with a prayer like the one Pygmalion finally whispered, a prayer so private that he could not even bring himself to say what he truly wanted? Most Greek myths answer mortal longing with a lesson or a punishment. This one answers with something else entirely, and that is what makes it worth telling. Tonight you'll hear the story of Pygmalion, the sculptor who despaired of the world, the ivory figure that became the whole of his heart, and the strange, tender miracle that happened when a goddess decided, for once, to simply say yes. If you enjoyed these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now settle in and come down to the workshop by the sea. Cyprus was the island of Aphrodite. The goddess of love had risen from the sea foam just off its shores, the old poet said, and had stepped onto land at the place called Paphos, where her greatest temple stood and her altars never went cold. On an island soaked in love, Pygmalion lived alone. A sculptor by trade, and by every account a brilliant one, he could coax living grace out of dead stone and ivory, and his carved figures seemed always on the point of drawing breath. But somewhere along the way, Pygmalion had lost his faith in actual people. The old stories say that certain women of his city had denied the goddess herself, and that Aphrodite, in her anger, had stripped them of all shame and all warmth until nothing gentle was left in them. Pygmalion watched them, and watched the hardness and vanity of the world around him, and quietly made a decision. He would have none of it. There would be no wife in his house and no companion at his table. He would live alone, wedded only to his craft, and let the whole business of love pass him by. It is one of the oldest ironies in mythology that the man who swore off love settled his life on the one island where love was a goddess with a temple, and that the goddess was paying attention. For a time, his lonely bargain held, and his days were quiet and full of work. And then, in an idle season, he began carving a piece of ivory. The block of ivory was pale and flawless, the color of milk, and finer than any he had ever worked. What Pygmalion intended when he first set his tools to it, no story records, perhaps a figure for some wealthy patron, perhaps nothing in particular at all. But as the weeks passed, something began to emerge from the ivory that he had never quite managed before. The figure was a young woman, standing at ease, robed in carved folds so soft they seemed to stir in a draught. Every line of her was gentle. Into her downcast, serene, half-smiling face, he carved all the kindness he had stopped finding in the world. Into the tilt of her head, he put patience and grace and something very close to warmth. Month after month, he worked in the sea light of the tall windows, and the more the figure grew, the more careful, almost reverent, his chisel became. The old poets say his skill was so great that the art hid itself, that no one looking at the finished figure could believe she had been carved at all. So completely did she seem a real girl who had simply paused mid-step and might at any moment continue. At last, one evening, Pygmalion set down his tools and wiped the ivory dust from her shoulders and stepped back to look at what he had made. And that long look, the poets say, is where all his trouble began. He had carved the woman he could not find. Now she stood in his workshop, 3 steps away and forever out of reach. What followed was a slow, strange, and very human surrender. At first, Pygmalion simply looked, long after the workday had ended, lamp in hand, finding excuses to pass through the room where the ivory girl stood. Then he began to talk to her, lightly at first, the way a man might talk to himself, and then not lightly at all. Some nights he told her about his day and asked what she thought of the work and let the silence that followed stand in for an answer. Before long, the gifts began. Painted shells and polished pebbles from the shore, small songbirds in cages, lilies and violets in their season, beads of amber that caught the lamplight and glowed. He draped her in robes of the softest cloth, set rings upon her carved fingers and a necklace at her throat, and found, as he admitted to no one, that she was beautiful, adorned, and no less beautiful without. In the evenings he arranged soft pillows on the finest couch in the house, as if a figure of solid ivory could be made comfortable there, and told himself that she looked pleased. Somewhere in all of this, past shame and past all sense, Pygmalion understood what had happened to him. The man who had sworn off love had fallen, completely, hopelessly, in love with a thing his own hands had made, a girl who could not hear him, could not answer him, and could never love him back. The Greeks did not tell this part as a comedy. There is an ache in the old telling, a lonely man, an empty house, and a perfect silence where a voice should have been. And on the island of Aphrodite, no ache of that kind went unnoticed for long. Every year, the whole island gathered for the festival of Aphrodite. Smoke rose from 100 altars along the shore at Paphos. Heifers with gilded horns were led garlanded through the crowds. Incense hung in the warm air, and the goddess's temple by the sea filled with worshippers asking for the things people always ask the goddess of love to grant. Among them, that year, stood Pygmalion. For a long while he waited near the great altar while the offerings burned and the crowd around him prayed aloud for husbands and for wives. When his own prayer finally came, it was barely a whisper. "Gods," he said, "if it is true that you can give all things, let me have as my wife." And there he faltered. Even before an altar, even to a goddess, he could not bring himself to confess that he had fallen in love with a statue. "Let me have as my wife," he finished quietly, "one like my ivory girl." It was a careful, embarrassed, roundabout prayer, and it fooled no one. Aphrodite was present at her own festival, as the poets say she always is, and she heard the words Pygmalion spoke and understood perfectly the words he did not dare to speak. The prayer was not for someone like the ivory girl, and the goddess, who had hardened hearts on that island before, decided, this time, to be kind. On the great altar, the flame suddenly gathered itself and leapt 3 times into the bright air. Pygmalion walked home along the shore, not knowing what the sign had meant. He was about to find out. Dusk had fallen by the time Pygmalion reached his house, and the workshop lay in shadow, the ivory girl a pale shape against the darkening windows. Out of habit, out of tenderness, he went to her, as he did every evening, and bent and kissed her. And the ivory was warm. Pygmalion froze. Statues do not hold the day's heat that way. Ivory against the lips is always cool, always smooth, always dead. He kissed her again, hardly breathing, and again the warmth was there, faint and unmistakable like skin. With a shaking hand he touched her arm, and beneath his fingers the hard ivory softened and gave, the way beeswax softens in the sun and yields to the thumb. Terrified of hoping, he drew back. The old poets linger on this moment because it is one of the most delicate in all of mythology. A man standing in a dark workshop, afraid that he is dreaming, afraid that he has gone mad, touching the same spot over and over as the impossible slowly insists on itself. The pale figure was changing in front of him. Color rose through the ivory like dawn coming into a pale sky. Softness spread through the carved folds of her robe, and when at last he pressed his fingers gently to her wrist, he felt unmistakable, steady, real, a pulse. The statue drew a breath. In the shadowed workshop where she had stood silent for so many months, the ivory girl was ivory no longer. She was alive and warm and standing 3 steps from a man whose prayer, whispered and half-finished at an altar that morning, had been answered beyond anything he had dared to ask. Slowly, like someone waking from a long and dreamless sleep, the girl opened her eyes. The Roman poet Ovid, who told this story more beautifully than anyone, gives her first moment a detail that has never been surpassed. Opening her eyes, he says, she saw the sky and her lover at the same time, the evening light through the tall windows, and the man whose love had called her into being, arriving together in one first glance. Whatever she felt in that moment, the poets leave gently unsaid. What the story does record is Pygmalion, overwhelmed, pouring out his thanks to Aphrodite, words upon words of gratitude to the goddess who had heard a mumbled, embarrassed prayer and answered the true wish hiding inside it. Oddly enough, the oldest tellings never give the ivory girl a name at all. Only much later did tradition name her Galatea, a name that means something like milk white for the ivory she had been, and Galatea she has remained ever since. The goddess, it turned out, was not finished with her kindness. When Pygmalion and Galatea were married, the old stories say Aphrodite herself attended the wedding and blessed the marriage with her own presence, the goddess of love standing witness for the man who had once sworn that love would never enter his house. Few mortals in any myth received such a grace. Fewer still received what came after, which was perhaps the rarest gift the Greek gods ever gave anyone, a quiet life and a happy one. The years that followed made no great noise in mythology, and that is precisely what makes them remarkable. Pygmalion and Galatea lived together on their bright island, and in time a child was born to them, a child named Paphos, from whom, the poets say, the goddess's own sacred city took its name. That city stood on the shore where Aphrodite had first stepped out of the sea, and its temple remained among the most famous in the ancient world. So the sculptor's family was folded, forever, into the very geography of love. Set beside the rest of Greek myth, such an ending is almost startling. Prayers in these stories tend to go wrong. Midas asked for gold and received a curse. Eos asked that her lover live forever and forgot to ask that he stay young. Gift after gift arrives from the gods with a hook hidden somewhere inside it. Pygmalion asked, barely dared to ask, and received exactly the happiness he wanted with no hook, no twist, and no bill arriving years later. Perhaps the bitter sweetness of this story lives somewhere else, in all the lonely years that came before, in a man so wounded by the world that he could only love what his own hands had made, and in the quiet fact that it took a goddess's miracle to bring one gentle soul within his reach. The myth does not dwell on any of that. It simply lets them be happy, which, in Greek mythology, may be the strangest ending of all. People have argued for a very long time about what the story of Pygmalion means. Some hear a story about art itself, about the way a maker pours so much of himself into the work that the work seems, at last, to look back. Others hear a warning about turning away from the world, or a dream about shaping a companion to order, and the story is old enough and quiet enough to hold all of those readings without complaint. But told at the end of the day, in the dark, it feels like something simpler. The story of Pygmalion is about a lonely man whose deepest wish was so tender and so embarrassing that he could not say it aloud even to a goddess, and about a goddess who heard the unsaid wish anyway and granted it without once punishing him for having it. The Greek gods were not often kind. Their answers to mortal longing usually came edged, a gift with a cost, a wish granted crooked, an arrow out of a clear sky. This one time, on an island that belonged to love, the answer came warm ivory turning to skin, silence turning to breath, a statue's stillness becoming a steady human pulse beneath a trembling hand. Every mythology needs at least one story like that, proof that the old world, which imagined so many punishments, could imagine mercy too. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.